Hello, it's M82, and today we're going to take our best friend, Jimmy, to space. Anyways, welcome back to another Flyout video. Today we plan on taking Jimmy into space, but there's a problem. Flyout in its current state only has air-breathing engines. That may change in the future as the game isn't finished, but for now, we can only use air-breathing engines. Obviously, that's a bit of a problem since space doesn't exactly have any air. But either way, I have an idea. If, and only if, we can achieve enough momentum using an air-breathing engine, I believe we can at least temporarily breach the line between atmosphere and space. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to hold a stable orbit, as you need to be able to change your direction in space in order to do your orbital insertion and all that, but we would be able to at least hopefully get into space. Now, there are a few definitions of what space exactly is that we have to consider. According to international law, for example, the Kármán line is where space begins. This is 100 kilometers above sea level, and anything that breaches this altitude is legally considered a spacecraft. This will make a good initial goal, but I believe I can go higher. NASA Mission Control, for example, places this line at 122 kilometers because all atmospheric effects become mostly negligible past this point. So 122 kilometers seems like a pretty good reach goal, but I do have some other goals for this test too. Obviously, as you guys can see, I am not just making a tube with a giant jet engine in the back, I am actually making a shuttle-style aircraft. This is because of my other goal that I've decided I need to return to the runway safely after takeoff, so no exploding, no incredibly high G-sustained turns, and no plummeting into the ground at Mach 4. Awesome, we had our parameters. From here, we just needed to make what I believe to be a realistic design for Jimmy to survive his first spaceflight. So naturally, we did decide on a space plane because of the whole glide back to the airfield goal, but this is what I have so far. As you can see by the anhedral wing shape and intakes, this thing was actually originally designed to be a wave rider. So similar to like the XB-70, for example, this thing would hypothetically use compression or the shock wave of going supersonic to generate a little bit of excess lift. Unfortunately, later on, as I was building the fuselage, I found that I'd have to add hardpoints and drop tanks and all this garbage underneath it that would completely ruin the shockwave, so I decided to not do a wave rider design. Then also there's the fact that it's a very unstable design and it makes it really hard to fly, and you know, we kind of wanted to be just safe and play a safe bet for our first flight with Jimmy. Then as you can see here, we kind of had this weird tail thing going on, but I decided to convert it into an almost box wing style tail. I have no clue what it'd actually be called though. Also, for the sake of paint, I decided to give it a space shuttle-esque skin to it. You know, the general white body and black leading edge of the wing, sort of like almost something you'd see in the original KSP game. Also decided to give it a black bottom to simulate the quote-unquote heat tiles that maybe a space shuttle would have. But then again, this thing wouldn't actually really need any of that because it would just be going straight up and down. But you know what, I thought it looked cool and I think that's good enough. You can also see that I decided to utilize a ramjet for the back. That's because we needed to get to really high speeds if we wanted to achieve this. I'm talking like Mach 4 plus, maybe even Mach 5. And the only thing perceivably in the game at the moment that can reach Mach 5 with ease is a ramjet. But the problem is obviously that ramjets generate zero thrust when they're not moving, and it takes a very high speed, usually supersonic, for them to generate any substantial levels of thrust. Obviously we can supplement this with modifying the diffuser of the ramjet, but it wasn't really enough to get us the thrust we needed. So either way, regardless of thrust or speed or any of that, we needed a way to take off with this giant ramjet in the back. That's why I decided to add like an almost first stage to this rocket. It really did feel like KSP now, but basically all it was two engine pods on hard points that once you got to a high enough speed, those hard points would drop and those turbine engines would drop and you'd be powered entirely by the ramjet. That, and I also added some fairly hefty drop tanks underneath the wings, that way we could get as much fuel as possible into this thing, because let's be honest, this thing would completely guzzle gas. I mean, I would be including two of the most powerful turbines possible underneath the wings that would just drop off into the ocean or onto the ground like nothing happened. And then on top of that, we're going to be powering this literally gigantic ramjet in the back. We needed a ton of fuel. So we did the engines, we did the shock cones, we did the drop tanks, we did all of that, we added the landing gear. It was around this time that I was starting to realize that we would literally not be able to use this thing as a wave rider because of the engines and the drop tanks and all that junk. So you don't see it yet, but a little bit later on I decided to completely remove that anhedral and just use as a normal plane for the stability bonus. So now we've got a snazzy paint job and some decorators, which is nice. I end up changing them a little bit off camera, but I really like the way they look, and I really like the way this thing turned out in general. But either way, next up is the interior. I do want to give this thing a fairly, usable interior for Jimmy, since this is his first space flight and he needs appropriate instrumentation and equipment in order to get up there, of course. So here we're shaping his control panel, his mirrors, his screens. We give him a little UFD even, I think. An attitude indicator, some gauges, these like breaker panels on the side. I honestly think it looks pretty cool. Of course, gotta include those gauges for the engines, those two little engines we got down there, their RPM gauges and fuel flow and all that. Although funny enough, I end up completely abandoning those little under-the-wing engines because it just doesn't work. I try a space flight with it, I didn't record it like an idiot, and they just didn't get me the thruster speed I needed, and nor did the ramjet. So instead I did this. I essentially took a turbine engine, a gigantic turbine engine, and I stuck it in the back and I gave it a very low pressure ratio, and I made sure it was dumping all of its air and fuel into that afterburner, and we made it as hot as possible. Jimmy, this is Mission Control. All pre-flight checks are complete. Ready for liftoff whenever you are.
Roger that, Mission Control. Commencing countdown.
And here was our final product. This jet engine didn't just perform, it overperformed. This thing could drive us to about Mach 5.2 straight up, and would essentially melt itself while doing so. The compressor temperatures on this aircraft got up to 1,200 degrees Kelvin on ascent. It's pretty safe to say that the engine would essentially be melting itself and need a full repair after this flight. Also, a little bit earlier on there, as you could see in our bottom left, we reached 150 kilograms of fuel being consumed every second with this engine. Of course, that's only in the thickest part of the atmosphere, and that's providing so much thrust it's almost 8 Gs of pure acceleration on Jimmy, but still. Pardon me because I forget the final value, but I believe this engine put out about 2 meganewtons of thrust at full power. At this point, we were starting to rival genuine rockets with thrust, and that's with only this tiny little launch vehicle we had here. Either way, with all that nonsense about our engine out of the way, if you haven't noticed, we are officially in space, not just by the legal definition, by the NASA definition as well. We just breached over 130 kilometers, and I believe that our final resting altitude is right around 142 kilometers here. So, all in all, that means that we breached space, even by NASA's terms, by about 20 kilometers. Even with an air-breathing engine, so that's pretty impressive. You know, earlier I did say that I wouldn't need the heat tiles, which I mean is true, but considering how much plasma this thing was generating by going Mach 5, it definitely got pretty hot. But it looks like we just reached our peak and we are now on the way down. Obviously this thing didn't get far into space or do any maneuvering, of course, but what can you expect out of an air-breathing engine? As I stated earlier, if you actually want to get in orbit, you absolutely need to have a non-air-breathing engine. Even in a hypothetical world of air-breathing engines that can put you at an orbital velocity, your trajectory will still remain with the semi-minor axis in the atmosphere, which would make it a decaying orbit at best. It wouldn't even complete a full revolution no matter what you did. Also, it's important to note that the atmosphere doesn't ever just magically end. there still is an essentially microscopic teeny weeny little bit of air particle still hanging out up here. It's just so small and so negligible that it's considered space. Also, everyone, apologies for the jump cut earlier. It's just re-entering the atmosphere didn't seem to work with my computer very well. Either way, as we're coming back down here now, you can see that the aerodynamics are starting to affect my aircraft. At this point in the approach, it becomes almost sketchy because of how much I'm wobbling, and it only increases the lower in altitude I get. I'm doing everything I can here with my controller to keep this thing stable. I'm doing every single movement against the oscillation of my aircraft, but it's just not entirely working. But either way, we pull out of it, so that's great. The thing is, this engine is very particular, and even on literally idle throttle, it'll still generate significant amount of thrust. I mean, you even see that afterburner effect while purely on idle with the engine fully open up, and it's still generating thrust. This is essentially because that entire turbine stage will just completely cease its movement entirely if it stops producing excessive amounts of thrust. The throttle needs to be so high for the engine to sustain idle that it will literally just generate enough thrust to fly off of that alone. I mean, I'm not even touching the throttle, it's at 0%, and I'm still holding 1.5 on the deck, it tells you exactly everything you need to know about this engine and how insane it is. So in order to make this approach, I'm essentially just turning the fuel off for 90% of it, and then flipping it back on for a microsecond, that way I can putt along with the throttle. You saw I did that little spin around earlier, and I'm basically all set. I'm on a perfect speed for approach, and I make it smooth as butter. Making some final little adjustments here and the landing goes perfectly. It does seem a little bit fast, but that's because this part of the video is at 2 times speed for those of you wondering. So I think everything appeared a little bit faster than I was actually going for you guys. But hey, we made it down on the ground alive. There is no damage to our aircraft and Jimmy is presumably still alive. So we have a successful first mission for the Jimmy space program. Hopefully Jimmy's contractors will look at this and see this and allow him to fly once more into space. Thank you all for joining me on this one. I hope to see you in the next one, and goodbye.